Let me tell you about the local government financing vehicle used to finance China's infrastructure projects, and how it created China's hidden public debt. The history of this instrument has quite deep roots. When China began implementing a policy called reform and opening up in the 1980s, it also launched a process of decentralization with the transfer of powers to local governments, which also included powers over financial revenues. And although legally there was a central tax collection agency in China, due to financial autonomy, local governments collected taxes themselves and then negotiated with the central government what part of the funds they would transfer to the central budget. In turn, this system of dependence of the central budget on local ones created a distorted revenue system. The lion's share of revenues settled in local budgets, and only a small part in the central one. For example, in 1993, the central budget received only 22% of all tax revenues. And this state of affairs forced the government to adopt a tax reform in 1994 to take control of tax collection. Of course, local budgets lost a significant part of their revenues. And given that at that time they reached a certain level of spending, this in turn led to a significant deficit in local budgets. Another problem for local governments was that they were prohibited from issuing municipal bonds and obtaining loans to finance their needs. That is why local authorities were forced to look for alternative sources of funding. A solution was quickly found. At that time, reforms were also being carried out in the banking sector. And according to this reform, local authorities could create local banks to develop the economy of the region. And although local governments could not take out these loans, to get around this restriction, local authorities began to create private companies that were actually controlled by local government officials. Then, land owned by local authorities was transferred to this company for a long-term lease. And then these companies took loans from local banks or issued bonds that were sold to these banks. And after receiving financing, they built an infrastructure project. Frankly speaking, the Chinese did not invent a bicycle here. They just took the well-known mechanism of public-private partnership and adapted it to their own conditions. But one of the main conditions for the successful implementation of this mechanism is the further commercialization of the project and making a profit. For example, the state transfers a highway to private ownership through a concession mechanism. Then the private company invests money in repairing the road or building a new one. For example, a concrete road. And then it has the right to collect fees from car owners who use this road to recoup costs and make some profit. In the case of Chinese enterprises, this mechanism worked a little differently. All these infrastructure projects were built not in order to commercialize them later, but simply in order to build the project. The logic of this decision was as follows. In the 80s, the Chinese decided that their government was not working effectively, and therefore they decided on a new system of assessing the effectiveness of officials and rewarding them for achieving certain goals. For example, for local authorities there is a whole list of indicators, starting from the level of economic growth and ending with such specific indicators as new industries, the number of patents, the level of exports, and so on. And the level of his salary and career growth depends on how much an official manages to achieve or exceed the planned indicators. And given that the level of economic growth is the main one for assessing efficiency, and the easiest way to achieve it is to build an infrastructure facility, this led to the fact that officials began to build them in a race, without worrying about the commercial component. Since such projects did not generate cash flows, special schemes were also developed to repay debts. One of the most popular was the sale of land or lease of land. This scheme worked as follows. First, an infrastructure project, such as a road, was built. Then this project led to an increase in business activity, and this in turn caused an increase in the value of land near the facility, which was then sold or subleased. And in this way, these quasi-state companies paid off their debts. And here it would seem that the scheme itself is ideal. So what went wrong then? The scheme was ideal while business activity and land values were growing. But after the slowdown in economic growth and the crisis in the real estate market, the scheme stopped working, and given that the lion's share of these projects is unprofitable in general, this can create serious problems for the banking system. In general, to understand the scale of the problem now, according to rough estimates, the debt level of these LGFVs is from $7 to $8 trillion. Because if most of these enterprises cannot repay their debts, then the government will have two ways to solve the problem, or do it for them, thus significantly increasing the level of public debt, or let them go bankrupt, which could lead to a domino effect. Because the banks that participated in this will follow them. And this in turn could lead to the collapse of the banking system. Personally, I think the government will intervene, especially since last year the Chinese government approved a program to issue government bonds worth 10 trillion yuan to overcome this problem. And I think this is just the beginning.